Walking with My Eyes Open by Kill Despair. Chapter 4, Fate and Destiny. Step 4, Analysis. Following experimentation, the next stage is to step back and examine the collected data. This step is characterized both by the confirmation of expected patterns and the further analysis of unexpected phenomena. On the morning of January 5th, 5740, Senkuu woke up for the first time to a painful cough and black nightshade petals. He had one conscious thought, and that was what he chose to focus on. But before his conscious mind came into play, he had 4 unconscious reactions too. The first was confusion. The second was denial. The third... This was annoying. Senkuu needed more time than this. He had too much left that needed doing for Senkuu to have time to die. That wasn't how this worked. Senkuu knew that wasn't how this worked. But still, the villagers had the war against Tsukasa. Taiju and Yuzuriha were still trapped playing spy in the Empire of Might. Chrome still struggled to make antibiotics alone. There were billions of people still trapped in stone that Tsukasa wouldn't care to save, so someone had to. And Senkuu wanted to see it. He'd come this far, hadn't he? That felt like it meant something, didn't it? He wanted to see the village grow. He wanted to see if Taiju ever grew the balls to ask out Yuzuriha, and he wanted to pretend he didn't care either way. He wanted there not to be a war anymore. He wanted to see what kind of scientist Chrome would turn into, what kind of Suika would become after that, if Senkuu was reading them right. He wanted to see how Ruri managed her first spring without pneumonia. He wanted to keep inventing things. He wanted to keep pushing the world back to where it should be, one grueling step at a time. He wanted to go to space. There was too much that needed to be done, and Senkuu was too busy to be distracted with dying. But there were 5 black nightshade petals laying in his hand and a telescope looking to a sky where no one waited anymore. And it didn't work like that. The third was fear. It wasn't love. Love would have been simpler. Gen sighed. Or no, that was probably another lie. Love would have been an ordeal in its own way, but at least maybe if Gen actually had fooled himself into falling in love, then Senkuu wouldn't still be suffering over Gen's mess. Unfortunately, outside of stories, there wasn't any such thing as fairy tale moments or selfish tricksters falling in love over a first kiss. Nothing was ever that easy. The closest they got to a storybook romance was Flower stroking airways, and Gen legitimately considered whether both him and Senkuu were cursed. No, instead, Gen had a crush. Well, he was calling it a crush at least. Gen hadn't exactly had a run-in with the term since he was maybe 13 and just starting to get his own shows. Normally, in Gen's life, i.e. some millennia before being encased in stone, it had been a pretty routine experience of attraction, maybe a semi-pleasant dinner or two, and getting it out of their systems to mutually move on. A crush sounded like the childish precursor to an actual relationship, a romantic relationship. Something which Gen had never had particular experience with. But Gen was attracted to Senkuu. He wouldn't bother denying that, not since that kiss, more accurately, the laugh that followed, where Gen looked at Senkuu and something in the pit of his stomach went, yes, that right there, him. Gen wanted to kiss him again, wanted to do more, wanted to tease him and hear the sharp replies back, wanted to figure out if he could make him blush long enough to see how far down it spread. Gen had always enjoyed Senku's company, more than was probably wise at times. Gen liked the village as a whole, but he'd admit that the meals he happened to sit by Senkuu, the nights they spent debating plans, the spare moments of lightly worded exchange, those tended to be his favorite. Senkuu was routinely difficult to categorize, too essential of a presence to be just a friend, too familiar to be just a co-conspirator, too close to be just a leader, too Senkuu to be anything just, if Gen was being honest. So what to call someone you're attracted to and also enjoy simply being around? Depressingly, a crush seemed to be the best term, which meant Gen had a crush with what had to be the worst timing in the world. Oh, sure, theoretically, it should have been easy. Senkuu was sick because Gen wasn't in love with him, so what could be more simpler than Gen taking a chance on a crush and letting himself fall back? Even if it took time, there was the off chance that Senku's disease could be cured, or at least stop progressing, if it was just a matter of waiting for Gen to fall in love back. Perfect! Hearts, confetti, and no flowers while riding off into the sunset. Fantastic. Only one problem. It was only a temporary cure. only a matter of time. Gen would never fall in love. He wasn't capable of it. He wasn't that type of person. He was a liar. And this was the cost. Here were the two secrets behind all lies. First, make the lies something the audience wanted to believe. Truthfully, Gen thought almost everyone wanted to fall in love. At the very least, considered it some lonely time. Call it a biological drive, sociology, psychology, societal pressure, etc. Humans fundamentally shape their lives around connections. So, was it really surprising they wanted one of their own? Their one maybe wanted a bit, maybe a lot, depending on the person. But Gen had seen it enough in the faces of his audience, in the shy requests for palm readings and the bated breath before he explained the difference between mentalists and fortune tellers. Gen thought everyone wanted someone they could believe sees them, someone to hold on to come home to. At the end of the day, Gen thought everyone was scared of being alone and realizing they didn't want to be. Being in love sounded warm. But that didn't make it true! The second best way to beat a trick is to understand how it works, and Gen already knew how the trick worked. A temporary high and then lying to yourself for the rest of your life that it wasn't a trick after all. After all, even a lie was better than being alone. Gen was a liar, a magician, a mentalist. How could he not know the power the mind had to weave an illusion so strong you could base a life on it? The best kind of lies were those that people desperately wanted to be true. Gen was the shallowest man in the world, and he knew it, because he couldn't force himself to believe love would really exist. He couldn't force himself to fall in love, even with such a beautiful, warm kind of lie. Gen was far too shallow to trick himself into believing he had that depth, because it would have to take depth, wouldn't it, to face an illusion and claw for something underneath? Gen told Senkuu he wasn't. He told him! Because an honest view of Gen wasn't something to fall in love with. Gen couldn't, and he was trying so hard to get Senkuu to see. Even if he wanted to be the kind of person that... Anyway, it wasn't about what Gen wanted. Gen had a crush. It would be far less cruel if it didn't. If it didn't feel like such an almost, but not enough. Because it wasn't love. And so it just made everything so much more complicated. The real choice was this. What was he going to do with it? Option 1. Bury the crush and continue his current plan of convincing Senkuu to fall out of love. Admittedly, a plan that hadn't shown overwhelming success yet. Option 2. Use the crush to try and convince Senkuu he actually had fallen in love. A second attempt on an earlier plan, but one Senkuu may believe now that there was some truth behind it. Gen wasn't that kind man. He was pragmatic, and he'd long decided he'd do absolutely anything, sink to any kind of low, be however ruthless he needed if it meant saving Senku's life. So, decisions. He shredded a petal under his nails and tossed it down. Gen? A blonde head popped up beside him. What are you doing? He smiled, making sure it was a soft one despite his mood, because he absolutely believed in paying favorites, and when it came to the village, to his entire life actually, it wasn't hard to guess the people that rested on top. Suika smiled back, a glimpse of bright blue eyes shining through the shadows of her mask. Then she tilted her head and lowered her voice. Are you hiding from work? Gen laughed, pressing a finger to his lips. Maybe a bit. Don't tell on me, okay? He winked. Besides, I was considering some options. Thinking counts as work too, doesn't it? Suika nodded, glancing down at the growing pile of mangled petals, then to the daisy Gen was still steadily demolishing. And the flowers are helping you think? Actually, Gen had just been feeling murderous towards flowers lately. Call it enacting justice vicariously. Not particularly. He picked up another flower from beside him and instead of shredding it, started to fold. You're right, I think there's a better use for these. A few more quick movements and he wove a flower bracelet just big enough to slip over Suika's wrist. Her grin brightened, looking at it like it was the next great marvel. So at least Gen had accomplished one thing today. It's so pretty, Suika said, looking up to see it closer. And the flowers are so close together. Can you teach me? Sure, once we get some more flowers. He picked up the last one, winding his fingers around the stem. You know, now that you mention it, there is an old game about flowers and decisions. Want to hear it? Suika sat patiently in front of him, eyes fixed on the daisy, because, of course, she wanted to learn. What other village could this be? It's very simple. Gen counted off with one hand, flower in the other. 2 phrases, you pick a petal on each, and the one you land on is your answer. Gen picked a petal. He loves me. Another petal. He loves me not. Suika gave a small gasp. Flowers can tell you if someone's in love? Gen didn't laugh because he knew it would be bitter. No, he said quietly. It's just a game. Back before even me and Senkuu, that is. Ladies would play it to see if their beloved would ever return their affections. It's silly. So, Suika thought a bit. It's like a wish, then? I think I'm using it more as a hex. Gen muttered as he got to the last petal and glared. He loves me. Well, fuck. Gen supposed that's what he deserved for trusting flowers. He gave his largest and most theatrical sigh for Suika's sake. Ah, Suika-chan, look at that. It seems like I lost. More's the pity for me. Suika grinned up at him, hopping to her feet and wrapping her arms around his hips. It's okay. I still love you. Gen patted her head, smiling despite himself. Maybe you were using the wrong flower, Suika told him. Could be. I'll go get more, Suika promised. Then you can find one that'll work. More flowers is a good idea, Gen agreed. But I think I'm tired of this game. Why don't I teach you how to make the best flower crowns in the entire stone world? Then we'll both have to be the most beloved people in the whole village, won't we? Immediately, Suika ran off to the woods and Gen watched her go. At least flowers could do good somewhere. He looked down at the mangled flowers. A daisy, purity and innocence. With a shift of his heel, he ground them a little further into the ground. Flowers were an awfully pointless thing to blame, but Gen was petty, and they were easier than the alternative. Still, he taught Suika how to make flower crowns, and when she pressed one last bloom into his hand, so excited to find the last one of the season, he took it like his heart had it plunged to his feet. It was hard to look at Black Nightshade and forget it was a poison. Gen flounced into the lab and greeted. If Suika mentioned something about plants predicting the future, it wasn't me. Just you saying that means it definitely was. Senkuu glanced up from a beaker. Please don't start some kind of prophecy cult mentalist. Ruin all of my fun then, Gen teased. That reminds me though, Senkuu-chan, I was contemplating and I think we may be cursed. Curses aren't real. Oh, really? Gen waved a hand. Think about it, your luck really is terrible. Turn to stone. The first guy you chose to wake up started a war. There was even that lightning thing. And now look, falling in love and dying from flowers. Fate has it out for you, Senkuu-chan. Senkuu rolled his eyes. Do you even believe in fate? Gen considered. There was a certain kind of charm of viewing everything, the petrification, the village, even the people beside him, as some kind of destiny. That they were important enough that their very lives were destined to be brought together and kept together. But he supposed he believed in fate rather like he believed in love. It seemed nice to have that kind of certainty, but he didn't know if the steadiness of destiny was meant for superficial men like him to poke at it. Maybe for some people, Gen decided. He watched Senkuu move around the lab. What about you, Senkuu-chan? Do you believe in fate and destiny? Like Gen didn't already know the answer. Senkuu shrugged. I guess I don't not believe. The answer wasn't that. Really? Gen ran it through his head and tried to find any puzzle pieces that fit. Senkuu answered for him. I don't know. When everything was petrified, I didn't want that to be the end of humanity. It could have been. I didn't have any evidence to say it wasn't, but I stayed awake. I don't know if that's stubbornness or destiny. Probably more faith than fate. What's the difference? Gen asked. Faith's a choice. Gen didn't know what to say to that. Senkuu waved a hand in dismissal, focusing back on the beaker. Who knows? Dad was better at thinking about that stuff. All the religious and philosophical stuff. Can someone be better at religion? Gen questioned. He was better at accepting questions for the sake of them. Reflection. Senkuu clarified. I'm not. I get the why, but the process frustrates me. Maybe that's not better or worse, but... He waved a hand, dismissing it. My point is, who knows about destiny or fate? They're variables that can't be tested from within the scope condition, and the scope condition's everything. We can't look at them from outside, so we can't observe them. That's not me saying they can't exist, it's saying we can't prove them. And if we can't prove what's supposed to happen, then, as far as we know, anything can. He set the beaker down. That's choice too. He met Gen's eyes. Anyway, what do you think about freeze-drying ramen? Gen blinked rapidly, still trying to catch up with the last part. What? Ramen, Senkuu said slowly. For the war. We're going to need to eat something if we can't hunt freely, so I was thinking we'd reinvent cup ramen. Sure, that sounded insane enough. Gen hummed. Cola cup ramen, really, Senkuu-chan. I'm starting to feel we're making up for your neglected university years. Yeah, Senkuu snorted. Universities I visited focused more on the labs and course offerings than the cafeteria. Gen saw Senku's eyes take on a slightly dazed look, most likely remembering giant spectrometers or fusion engines or whatever it was that was kept in fancy science labs, which was really just completely unacceptable given what Gen remembered about university campuses. Oh, Senkuu-chan, Gen shook his head. Universities aren't just about the classes, it's the experiences. Is it? Senku's voice was completely neutral, not even the slightest thing off about it. But he also looked up. Red eyes met Gen's, and the air suddenly felt like it had the slightest traces of something. Gen kept his smile. There was a... Gen guessed he'd called it a static there after the kiss. It felt like an additional awareness, like magnets under his skin, pulling him into Senku's orbit. What experiences am I missing then, mentalist? Senkuu asked casually. Gen's throat felt dry. Logically, Gen suspected Senkuu was aware of it too. Even if he didn't know Gen felt it, Gen was fairly sure that was how crushes worked, and Senkuu had claimed he was in love with him, had implied wanting to kiss Gen wasn't an issue, and had seemed to enjoy the kiss they did have. So yes, logically, Gen supposed it made sense that Senkuu also felt the shift, but then again, it was still Senkuu. Senkuu, the true master of compartmentalization, Senkuu. So who really knew? The lack of confirmation made for a very irritating, untethered feeling that kept making it even harder for Gen to decide which choice would be best. Maybe he hasn't mentioned it, but Gen hated crushes. Oh, you know, Gen said, and proceeded to mention absolutely none of the things he was currently thinking. The usual stuff, skipping classes, hangovers, the joining clubs. All of those sound terrible, Senkuu said, and you didn't even go to university. I played shows at some, Gen defended, tamping down on the crush hard. That counts. Sure. Definitely. Senku's grin tilted up just as his voice dipped lower. Guess you're my expert then. Fucking... Ah! Stupid Senkuu-chan! Guess so, Gen agreed, leaning forward and propping up his head. I'm an expert on a lot of things, actually. Senku's eyes did this thing where they crinkled after he snorted. Did he know they did that? It was pretty horrible, actually. Definitely horrible. Of course, mentalist. Don't feel bad about it, Senkuu-chan, Gen continued. You're pretty smart on a few things, too. High praise. Gen's smirk felt like it had physical weight. Gen swallowed. Okay, enough. Time for a decision. Gen breathed out and focused. What would work best? For Senkuu. Senkuu, who would notice the shift eventually, even if he hadn't already. So, if ignoring the thing between them wasn't working, it might as well be option 2, and use it. Gen was nothing but adaptable. He would do anything to meet his goals, no matter the cost of the lie. So, option 2. Gen shifted the conversation, purposefully this time. Actually, he said softly, that's what I came to ask. I wanted to check if you had any more experiments for me. There was a pause. Senkuu stopped setting the beaker down. Not for now. I told you, the physical stimulus test was the last one I needed. Now it's just analyzing results and refining. Gen sighed. Pity. Senkuu was watching him in a different way now. Not exactly the way Gen was aiming for, but that was Senkuu. Instead, Senkuu stepped closer, narrowing his eyes like he was trying to pick Gen's answer apart like a chemical equation. Gen smiled, making sure it looked a little nervous. It was disconcertingly easy to manage. Thought you'd be glad to be done with them, Senkuu said finally. You complained about the research part enough. Well, that was the research. I might not like my conversational partners shocking themselves, but I've never minded the talks with you, Senkuu-chan. And as for the other experiments... Gen took a breath, letting his next words hold weight. Some of them I enjoyed more than expected. His eyes lingered on Senkuu after. Implying? offering. Senkuu was... Well, Gen would be an idiot to say he didn't see some suspicion there, but Senkuu was still listening. There was still the sense that he was evaluating Gen's words rather than shutting it down completely. Gen's heartbeat sped up, and he struggled to keep it back down. That was an opening. That was a chance. Gen could work with that. He had to. Some of them, Gen said, a voice low, some of them were fun. Take the bait! Fun, Senkuu repeated flatly. Gen thought wildly of bloody flowers, red eyes, and a very nice laugh, and felt his hands clenched at his sides. He kept his voice even. Fun? Did you have fun, Senkuu-chan? Senkuu asked instead of answering. What do you want, mentalist? It didn't matter what Gen wanted. Who cared? This was bigger. I'm trying to say, Gen's voice caught. No, he could do this, of course, he could. Trying to say what? Senkuu asked again. Gen was made for these sort of petty lies. Gen tried, and the words stopped again. He could hear his pulse in his ears. Say it! He pushed the words out by force. I love you. Silence. Absolute silence. Senkuu leaned back and stared at him. Gen managed to hold it for an entire second before he buried his face in his hands and groaned. The moments sputtered out between them like a deflating balloon. Somewhere Gen thought he heard his remaining dignity let out a dying wheeze. Senkuu let out a low whistle. Wow. Shut up! Gen moaned. It was without a doubt the worst sounding love confession in the entire world. Gen didn't think Senkuu would believe it unless he was drugged and concussed. Even then it was doubtful. With a very much lucid Senkuu in front of him, it didn't stand a chance. Mentalist. Senkuu shook his head in not-so-silent judgment. That sounded actually painful. Want to try again? No! Gen said, pathetically. He didn't think his pride could take it. He was supposed to be good at this! I don't even mind the lie, that's just you, but that was terrible. Senkuu shrugged, already heading back to his work. So you went back to your old plan then. Bad move. Should have stuck to your argue me out of love plan or whatever it was you were trying the last few months. Gen peeked up from behind his hands. It was working? Senkuu snorted. Nah, but it's a lot less annoying than the whole fake confession stuff. He met Gen's eyes with a smirk. Give it up, mentalist. At least the whole love cynicism angle made for a good debate. You're the worst! Gen complained. I hate you! No, you love me? Apparently. Gen kicked at him. Senkuu dodged it. The confession trick isn't going to work, Gen. Not a millimeter's chance. I'm telling you, change tactics. Well, okay, now Gen wanted to keep trying out of spite. Senkuu seemed to read that thought on Gen's face because his stupid smirk tilted wider. Then Gen met his eyes, wetting his lips to argue. Senku's gaze flicked down just a second, his lips pressed together tighter, a slight twitch in his fingers. Gen got it, stared at it. He wasn't sure the reaction he gave, but when he looked up, Senkuu was already looking away. A series of small gestures, really too little to pick up on if someone wasn't already looking for them. And if someone was, that meant... Oh, so Gen wasn't the only one who'd noticed the shift. He wasn't the only one that picked up on the tension. And they both knew it. Gen knew they did. He could tell in the way that the static had built into more like an electric charge, thrumming in the space between them. How very dangerous. The untethered feeling was gone, but in its place, Gen's heart rate picked back up. He could still use this. That confession failed. Another one so soon after wouldn't work, but what about in between? What would delay the disease more? Gen didn't... He wasn't sure, but then again, this wasn't about what Gen thought about it. What mattered? What are you thinking, Senkuu-chan? Gen asked honestly. Right now? Senku's mouth quirked up, turning the smirk into a smile. Nothing you can't figure out? Gen huffed. Well, that's maddeningly unhelpful, Senkuu-chan. Thanks a bunch. You're overthinking it. And what did that mean? He didn't have time to ask because then Senkuu stepped back because it was absolutely frustrating and that was not the direction that Gen needed him to go. Dang it! The air dragged itself back into Gen's lungs with the stale taste of disappointment. So, evidently, that meant Senkuu had decided that the safest option was to do nothing, which, yes, fine. Gen needed to work on his plan more, and Senkuu was doing whatever Senkuu had chosen that apparently Gen was overthinking. Best option for both of them being to ignore it for now. And Gen was still annoyed. So which do you want, mentalist? Senkuu asked casually. Gen blinked. What do I want? Gen couldn't help but lilt those words. That's a loaded question, isn't it? Who could say? Gen let any possible answer go with a hand wave. What for what? For ramen, Senkuu clarified, sounding amused. Of course. Ramen, Gen repeated. To be honest, Gen didn't care a thing for ramen at the moment. He rolled away the built-up tension from his neck with a pleased sigh before pinning his eyes back to Senkuu. Why don't you surprise me, Senkuu-chan? And quite surprisingly indeed, a trace of pink bloomed up the back of Senku's neck as he turned away, muttering under his breath. Got it. Ignoring it might be harder than intended. As professional advice from Asagiri Gen, mentalist extraordinaire, it turns out, funny enough, that both people being aware of a mutual attraction didn't actually help anything at all when it was generally agreed it would be a terrible idea to act on it. In fact, it made the whole thing so much worse. Because now, it meant that Gen always felt that buzzing trace of something in their conversations, at times easier to ignore than others. It came in and out seemingly at random, turning innocuous teasing into a little more like a well-performed tightrope act. Like the sense that something would happen. Like anticipation. It was... Well, Gen didn't hate it, which meant it was horrible. Because nothing would happen. Yeah, probably. Gen was still unsure what the safest approach was when a wrong move could make the entire disease worse as much as better. And Gen wasn't in love. That said, he still thought the fake confession route might have the most merit. The annoying appearance of the crush didn't negate his original plan of convincing Senkuu that love was a meaningless surplus of hormones, but it did make it more complicated. Even if it might not work forever, a fake confession might at least give them the time they needed for Senkuu to finish the research he needed for the cure. And that required planning and perfect timing. Gen couldn't afford another failed confession again. Not if he wanted Senkuu to ever believe it. In the meantime, Gen had decided that the best approach was space. Less distracting for both of them, and who knows, maybe there was truth in the absence makes the heart grow fonder. At least it could give Gen the clarity to think. Hey, Gen! Hand me the new gear, would you? The unfortunate part was that volunteering for every space not around Senkuu was also a space of mind-numbing manual labor. Gen eyed the setup skeptically. Is this safe? What do you mean? Chrome stared uncomprehendingly from where he was hanging, upside down, on top of a water wheel, over rushing, freezing, cold water, and only a flimsy rope keeping him from falling down in it. Never mind. Gen handed down the intricately carved wooden gear from his own spot atop the much steadier support beam. Here. Thanks! Chrome bent down, already focused on securing it in. Don't worry, Senkuu said the last one just broke because the wood had a crack in it. This one should hold up much longer. Gen made a noise of minor relief. Actually, I was surprised you were free to help, Chrome said. You've been helping Senkuu a lot, right? With the new, smaller stuff for the war? Help is probably optimistic, Gen smiled. I think it's more akin to running around and grabbing the chemicals while Senkuu does the hard work. No worries, you're still definitely his favorite lab assistant. If he didn't need you leading with the second phone, of course. He's been explaining it to me in the nights. Besides, that wasn't really... Chrome trailed off and started again. I just meant you've been spending more time with him lately, right? Gen kept himself from going tense. I suppose. Just to help with the projects. There was nothing suspicious about that, right? Nothing to give away either the crush or the disease. Chrome was still clearly hesitating. Does he seem... I mean, I don't know. Does Senkuu seem like he's doing all right? Gen frowned. What do you mean? I mean, well, Senkuu explained about the allergies and stuff, and he said that wasn't anything to worry about, but... Chrome sighed. It just seems like there's something wrong. It's not just the coughing. He's been sleeping more lately, and maybe that's just because of the planning, but he just seems tired, you know? I think he's lost weight, too. Gen stopped. Have you noticed? Chrome asked. No, Gen admitted, because he hadn't. Even pulling up a picture in his mind, Gen had trouble remembering the differences. How could he not notice? Or did he just not want to? Okay, maybe it's nothing then. Chrome didn't sound as reassured. He pulled back right side up as he finished getting the gear in. Just do me a favor and keep an eye on him, would you? Even if it's nothing. You know Senkuu. He's really good at taking care of the rest of us, but he's kind of not that great about telling when to take care of himself first. Gen let out a strained laugh. He's really not. Chrome grinned. That's why it's our job to watch out for him. Right. Gen tried to smile. Chrome tugged up the rope and untied it. So that's done. You coming back to the village? I think I might stay and walk a bit, actually, Gen said softly. It'll be spring soon. Might as well see if any plants showed up early. Chrome gave him a thumbs up. Get at him! Gen waited, watching as Chrome headed back to the village. Gen needed time to think. It was a race. That's what it always was, wasn't it? Gen and Senkuu, and which could slow down the disease so they could find the cure the fastest. The idea of not finding a cure... Gen knew it. He'd faced the pressure of Senku's approaching death on a daily basis since he first heard of the disease. But it had always been approaching. Not imminent, not yet a reality. Gen had never considered Senku's death as something where he'd have to face the consequences rather than forestall the event itself. He'd never had to consider an after. It was early evening by the time Gen wandered back to the village. The sky was held in the early stages of twilight, too much light to quite be called night, but dark enough that most in the village had already set out tending evening fires and starting dinner. It made the lab, the heart, really, when it came to the kingdom of science, seem still, heavy like the deep blues in the sky. Gen wanted to see Senkuu. He felt like he needed to, actually, which wasn't exactly an unusual feeling ever since the new crush. This was different, though. Attraction still under the surface, but, well, Gen just wanted to see him. The issue with that was what Gen found when he leaned against the door. Senkuu was asleep. His face was slack where it pressed against the cool glass of the lab table, breathing shallow and slightly uneven in the way it hitched every now and then. His stray bangs caught around his nose in a way that really should be swept away. Gen felt his throat go tight. It wasn't as if Gen had never seen Senkuu sleep. When Gen did decide to stay in the village perimeter, he shared sleeping space with both Senkuu and Chrome more nights than not, and Gen was always the last to sleep and the first to rise, so of course he'd seen Senkuu sleep before this. But in the dark of night, Gen had never really looked. Senkuu awake was vibrant, distracting, and such a constant force in Gen's day-to-day life that he didn't know the last time he'd cataloged the changes. Or maybe that was another lie. He'd certainly been looking at Senkuu lately, so maybe Gen had just avoided noticing. With Chrome's words still ringing in his head, Gen was noticing now. Senkuu had gotten paler. And maybe that could be accounted for by winter. Maybe the sheen of sweat and uneven breaths could be brushed away when working. Maybe the way his limbs sometimes shook when standing was just fatigue. Maybe the way that he'd started sticking to the lab rather than running across the village was just avoiding the cold. Maybe Senkuu always made it so easy to brush concerns aside. Senkuu shifted in his sleep, breath catching, waking. Gen didn't breathe, didn't move. Senkuu woke up anyway, blinking his eyes blearily and yawning until he focused on Gen in the doorway. Gen's hand itched the urge to brush away the bangs still hanging in Senku's eyes. Instead, he just stood there. Hello there, Senkuu-chan. Hey. Senku's voice sounded scratchy. What time is it? We still have time before dinner, Gen said quietly. You can go back to sleep. I didn't mean to wake you up. Nah. Senkuu leaned up from the table and stretched his back. I've been sleeping too much anyway. I need to get some work done. He gestured to a mess of wires and bulbs. Got a few ideas I want to work out for the war. Gen paused. The war still? I know it's important, but we don't have a cure yet, and you said the timeline for this disease would end before the war started. Shouldn't the cure be a priority? It's a priority, Senkuu agreed, but right now I don't have any ideas. He grimaced. Well, okay, one idea, but I'd rather hold off on it until I know that finding a way to gather stomach acid wouldn't just make the whole thing worse. He waved a hand at his lab table. I need time to think of ideas on a cure. But until then, I also have the village and the war to worry about. I can't put those aside while I run myself into a wall on a disease that isn't quite clicking yet. Gen didn't think he agreed with that reasoning. Actually, he knew he didn't, but the only argument he could make was, the war we can survive. If we don't find a cure in time, you'll die. How could anything else ever be a priority faced with that? But Senkuu didn't seem bothered. Trust me, I know. We'll find the cure again. No use worrying about it. What if we don't? We will. Ken took a breath. Right. He stepped around the lab, walking to the other side of the table and sitting on the stool that Senkuu had finally gotten around to asking Kaseki to build. He continued to watch Senkuu as he moved, trying to catalog all the details, anything so he wouldn't miss it again. He thought Senkuu had probably noticed him staring, even half asleep, but he didn't comment, which Gen was grateful about. So why are you here? Senkuu asked. Chrome told me you left this morning. Figured you'd head for food first. Gen gave a small smile. Maybe I was trying to find somewhere to nap. How could I know this one was taken? Senkuu snorted. It's a crappy spot for a nap anyway. Glass tables are horrible pillows. Ah, well then, thank you for saving me from a neck cramps, Senkuu-chan. Gen let his voice trail off, tracing idle patterns on the table. He didn't look at Senkuu when he spoke. Hey, Senkuu-chan, if we don't solve this, would you have any regrets? Besides the obvious, I mean. The obvious? Not solving it in time? Falling in love with Gen in the first place? He heard Senkuu sigh. Who doesn't? Nothing that important. Do you really want to talk about this? Not really, Gen whispered. Then why are we? Well, because right now it seemed like both the most and least kind thing to do. If we don't, would you have any last requests? Gen asked. A pause. And before he even said anything, Gen knew that Senkuu was about to brush it off. Would it be very final if I said it right now? Senkuu answered and gave a small smile. No need to start writing my will yet, mentalist. I've still got some time before kicking the bucket. At least a few more weeks. Let's save it with the whole final requests. We don't have to do this now, okay? The words ached anyway. Maybe it didn't matter if Senkuu understood the weight of his life. Maybe it was better that he didn't. Fear did funny things to the mind, so maybe it would be better if Gen held that weight alone. Despite everything, the dismissal, it actually just felt like relief. Gen didn't have to ask. Senkuu was the one who didn't want to talk about it. That was better. So why hadn't Gen's pulse calmed down? He moved on. Okay, Gen said, and with all the experience of training, cast his tone back to light. Agreeable, a sign that things were okay. He smiled. So what are you working on then, Senkuu-chan? When he looked up, he found Senkuu staring at him, brow drawn down. Gen wondered why. He didn't get time to think before Senkuu turned away, coughing in his hand. Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. You know Morse code, right? Gen frowned at the sudden change of topic. Yes, he assumed. But that's a weird thing to assume. Gen shrugged. I'm not assuming if I'm asking, right? I suppose. The point is, Senkuu continued, we should count on using at least some Morse code to sneak the other cell phone into the Empire of our Might. I don't trust how long we can distract Homura. Gen hummed, focusing on their battle plan. This he could do. And I take it I'm in the sneak the phone in group? Senkuu nodded. Yeah, looks like it. Unless we magically get someone else that knows the Empire of Might's layout. Gen picked a speck of dirt off his clothes. You know, if there's one thing I hate about this stone world, it's all the walking. Believe it or not, I used to go on fitness jogs for fun. For fun! Can you believe that? Says the guy who got lost in the forest all afternoon. Your life is truly a burden, mentalist. Gen huffed on principle. So where is our plan to hide the phone, Senkuu-chan? I don't know if you're aware, but the big box thing isn't exactly as discreet as my old phones were. Don't worry, I already know where we're going to leave it. Someplace that I'm 10,000,000,000% sure that only Daiju and Yuzoria will care to go. Where's that? Senkuu shrugged. My grave. Gen went still. Your what? Gen asked, and the question sounded off. Off like it was coming from far away. My grave. Senkuu frowned, noticing Gen's expression. Fuck, did Taiju and Yozuriha not set one up? They were supposed to. If they didn't, that's going to make things harder. Gen shook his head. They did. And strange, now that he thought about it, he did remember the place being mentioned a few times. Back those few weeks he was still pretending to be a loyal lackey. A tiny place on the steep side of the mountain where Taiju and Yozuriha would sometimes disappear. Gen had never bothered to ask more. A grave. Senku's grave. Because whatever happened between Senkuu and Tsukasa, far back before Gen opened his eyes, Tsukasa believed Senkuu should have been dead. Believed it enough to not question a grave marker or the grief of the two surviving friends, and only even slightly doubted it because of a falling tree and a girl that should have been left under it. Tsukasa wasn't the one who did things in half measures, and he thought Senkuu was dead, that he'd killed him himself. And look at that, Gen's hands were shaking. The lab felt very, very quiet, except for the ringing in Gen's ears. Senkuu, Gen said softly, I have a question. How did you get Tsukasa to believe he killed you? Senkuu looked up at him. Oh, technically he did kill me. And then he sighed, like it didn't fucking matter! The dismissal didn't feel very much like relief anymore. Gen's laugh was too full of edges. What was that? I mean, medically, I was dead, Senkuu clarified. He crushed my cervical plexus, broke the nerve. He glanced up again and paused at his expression, voice dropping a touch softer. Don't worry, mentalist, he did it one blow. There wasn't any pain. I died instantly. Died. Senkuu died. Senkuu had been dead. Oh, Gen managed. You seem very active, Senkuu-chan, for someone who... It was a plan, Senkuu explained. The ringing in Gen's ears was the last sound for drowning men swept away in the current, like the cracked piece of wood in the water wheel. Plan, Gen echoed. He walked around the table, met Senku's eyes. You planned for this. Granted, Senkuu said. It was a last-minute one, but I had a suspicion it would work. When I broke out of the stone, there was a bit on the back of my neck that never fully unpetrified. I didn't worry about it until we got Yuzuriha, and I realized the stone could mend cells around it. He tried for a smile, still looking warily at Ken's expression. You'd be proud, mentalist. I used subliminal suggestion, got Tsukasa to focus on my neck. If he hadn't aimed there, or Taiju and Yuzuriha didn't find the piece of stone fast enough, well... Well... Tsukasa killed you! Gen's voice was no longer steady. You were dead! He actually killed you! Senkuu hesitated. He did give me a choice. Give up science and he'd let me live. Well, the pressure broke. The wood snapped. All that was left was a flood. That's not a fucking choice! Gen yelled. Not for you! He killed you! You died! You were... Gen wasn't a violent person. He preferred to poison with words rather than knives. He wasn't particularly kind, but he was patient. He knew how to play to his strengths and wait for the right opportunity to get past anyone standing in his way, no drop of blood involved. He'd never wanted to see someone dead before. Which reminded him. He turned to Senkuu. You forgave him for that! Senkuu winced. I wouldn't say forgave. We're fighting a war with him, Gen hissed. A bloodless war. Because you wanted this to be bloodless, because you planned for it to be. All of your plans. If that isn't forgiveness, then what is it? He's still like us. I don't have to forgive him to not want him dead, Senkuu answered, a hint of iron back in his voice. Or the rest of his men dead. Or did you forget about them? Do you think a war is just about one person? I told you, I've told everyone I'm not interested in anyone dying. I'm saving all of them I can. Senku's jaw moved, going tight as if rolling the next words in his mouth before deciding whether to let them out. And don't pretend like killing any other human actually got easy just because you're pissed right now. It's not. Senku's eyes pressed into him. And you wouldn't, Gen. Not as long as you had a choice. You're not that type of person. Gen didn't know about that. Not right now. But fine, Senkuu sighed. You made your points. I wouldn't say I forgive him. I don't know if I ever will. But I guess I do still respect him. In some kind of sense, at least. If not, I wouldn't be able to plan a bloodless war. Not if there was no way I thought I could beat him and think he was the type of person to accept it. Gen took a minute to think about that. To truly see a future after this war. The one that Senkuu believed, where he could negotiate a peace between the Kingdom of Science and the Empire of Might. A future where Tsukasa could even act as an ally rather than an enemy. It sounded too good to be true. A fucking light bulb in the Stone Age. It sounded like something that would get Senkuu killed, even in the attempt. If he wasn't dead already from choking on stupid flowers. Oi, mentalist. Gen. What is it? Gen looked up. You're crying, Senkuu told him, and Gen realized he was. And, of course, Senkuu sounded concerned right now, when it was only for someone else's tears rather than Senku's own life. Senkuu didn't get it. It didn't matter what Gen wanted. What mattered... What part are you upset about? Senkuu asked. I'm not upset, Gen whispered, and it was only half a lie. I'm angry. Gen was incandescently, furiously angry. How could Gen never consider an after Senkuu? How can you be so careless? Gen hissed, stepping forward and stabbing a finger into Senku's chest as he did. How can you keep risking your life like it doesn't matter? I don't, Senkuu frowned. Oh, really? Yes, really. Senkuu snapped back, color finally blooming on his cheeks, even as the words became rasped through his scratched throat. Every risk I take is calculated. Everything I do is necessary. You think I'm being, what, reckless? Why? Because I've got so much interest dying for nothing. Don't be an idiot, mentalist. I take as much care of my own life as I do with everyone. But you're not everyone! Gen screamed at him. Senkuu flinched. I am. You're not! Gen shouted. How could you even... Of course you're not! No one else here knew how to make a generator, or a phone, or an antibiotic, or even the ramen! No one else knows even half the things you do, even a quarter! You're our leader! You're indispensable, Senkuu! I'm not, Senkuu said quietly. I can't be. You can't keep treating me like I am. Gen laughed bitterly. Who were you trying to convince? You're dying, and you can't even pretend to take me seriously, even when I tried to talk to you about it. Senkuu slammed his hand on the table. Of course I'm taking it seriously. Do you think I want to die from this? He breathed out, trying and failing to control his breath. But I can't be indispensable again. Senkuu! Gen looked at him. How can you not be? Gen, you're not getting it. I can't be. You're in denial. I'm not the one in denial. You are. There can't be an after. That's not... Gen's heart was pounding in his chest. His hands were shaking, the ringing still in his ears. You have to be here. Without you, we won't be able to do any of this. We can't. We don't know science like you do. Gen, listen to me, Senkuu shouted, and the words were scraped raw. I can't be indispensable. None of us can be. That's not how this works. We're humans. Gen froze. I'm human, Senkuu reminded, like a cross between fact and request. And we can't be indispensable. None of us. Humans die. We all die. And we don't get to know when. I could die in the war, or from the flowers, or sulfuric acid, or the flu, or I could get hit by fucking lightning tonight, for all we know. If humanity, if everyone, if anyone only lives because of one person, then we all die. That's not a life. That's not... Senkuu broke off coughs that sounded more like heaving shoulders falling as he tried to hold it off and grabbing his chest to steady it. Gen couldn't move, couldn't stop it, never could, really. Senkuu wiped away his mouth before Gen could see clenched flowers. The anger was draining away thickly, for both of them, and what was left felt bruised and raw. Senkuu sounded steady again when he spoke, even as his voice rasped out. That's not how this is supposed to work. It's impossible. It's unsustainable, I know. Senkuu breathed out. I get what you want me to be. What Chrome in the village thinks of me, but I can't be immortal again. I can help. I can make things better and faster. I will. I don't risk my life needlessly, but I refuse to be put on a pedestal either, just so people can forget I'm human too. I can't be indispensable. I don't want to be. He looked up and met Gen's eyes. Do you understand? Gen closed his eyes and breathed. Did he understand wasn't the right question. Of course, Senkuu understood. Why wasn't that obvious? How could anyone spend 3 millennia in stone, months alone, thinking they were the only human alive, died once before, and not understand exactly how fragile their life really was? And Senkuu was right. No amount of need could change the basic facets of mortality. To be needed beyond that, it sounded like kindness, it sounded like love, but human shoulders weren't meant to bear the expectations of divinity. The only thing it added was pressure. A village that treated him like a new source of hope, friends that were counting on him while stuck behind enemy lines, a father that believed in him enough to weave stories unheard for 3 millennia, and the rest of humanity trapped in stone and waiting. Senkuu only wanted to be needed like a human. That was kindness. So how could Gen not understand? The question was how to answer it. Gen opened his eyes and said nothing because he didn't know. Senkuu wasn't looking at him. You're right about the first part, though. Oh, well, you're not wrong. I'm shit at watching people worry about me. I fucking hate talking about this stuff. But we do actually need a plan in place. And I have been thinking about it. He breathed out. Here's what you need to do about Tsukasa to end the war without me. Gen jerked his head up. What? No, listen, Senkuu ordered, and this tone was entirely different. No room for argument, the chief, rather than the scientist. I know you don't want to hear this, but you're right. We need to talk about this at least once. If I die, Tsukasa doesn't have a reason to attack the village. Tell him I'm dead, bring my body, prove it. That way you can reach a peace before the war even starts. He sighed. It's Tsukasa. His terms will be that the village give up revival science. Gen wasn't ready. They won't do that. He shook his head. Senkuu-chan, even if you do die, actually, I'd bet especially then, the village will never give up science now that they have it. Any science. They will if you convince them, Senkuu said, and his voice was firm, utterly sure. Because this was the plan. The plan. One that Senkuu had apparently been considering for a long time. Possibly since he first spit up flowers. Curing the disease wasn't one option, but if they didn't, if Senkuu... This was always going to be the other option. Gen, I need you to listen to me. It was one thing to understand and accept that Senkuu was mortal. It was another thing entirely to plan for his death, as if it could happen. I am, Gen said quietly. Senkuu grimaced. I'm sorry. You're the one who can do it best. It's Tsukasa. He wants to get rid of the revival science so he can make a new world. I don't think he'll make them give up the other science. He's smart enough to know they'll need medicine eventually. And for the rest, well, he's got to keep his men happy too. Science is a bargaining chip. Convince the villagers to make a peace with Tsukasa. Negotiate your amnesty. When you do, Tsukasa keeps his word. If he says you'll be safe, he'll make sure of it as much as he can. It won't be comfortable. It won't be pleasant. But you're clever. Give it enough time and all of you will be fine. You can live. Gen muffled a laugh, too strained to be anything like a laugh. Sure, Senkuu, he said. Yeah, I'll make sure everyone's all right. Senkuu watched him. Thanks. It's selfish, I get that. But someone needs to. And the rest... I'm sorry. Don't apologize, Gen said quietly. Just... stop, don't apologize. Did you ask me because... Actually, Gen didn't want Senkuu to answer that. He knew anyway, and the part he wasn't sure about, he didn't want to hear. Gen swallowed. It's a good plan. Yeah, maybe. I just need... Senkuu shook his head. I have too many plans, too many ideas. The village needs me too much, I know they do. I can't exactly start it all at once. They can't even read yet. We've got too many steps to cover first. I don't have time to handle everything. Senku's hands gripped down on the table. This plan, it's only the backup plan, okay? I still have every confidence we can solve this. This disease does have a cure. We just need to find it, I promise. For the first time, Gen heard the words for what they were. A promise. Senkuu had always made it a promise. The worst liars in the world and the most honest men could both make promise after promise after promise without anyone to say for certain which was which. So was the promise a truth or a lie? Neither. Both. Promises were nebulous things balanced ever so carefully right behind a truth and a lie, with only the future to tip the scale. We're going to cure this, Senkuu promised, and it wasn't quite a truth, unless they let it be. Of course we will, Gen promised, and it wasn't really a lie. He wouldn't let it be. Senkuu gave a small smile, the expression shockingly open in place of the smirk. It made him look younger, or maybe just his age. We're going to solve this, Senkuu repeated firmly for one last time, and this time Gen thought it was more for Senkuu himself than Gen. I know, Gen laughed and made sure it sounded real. Since when do we let pushy diseases win, huh, Senkuu-chan? Of course we will. Senku's face was calmer now, shoulders less heavy. He cleared his throat and then, because Senkuu, even in the face of large emotional upheaval, avoided heart-to-hearts like the plague if possible, and was the most fundamentally practical person in the world, he continued with, anyway, unless you really did come here to sleep, get out, would you? I still want to make up some flash bombs before it gets too dark to measure chemicals, and it's almost dinner. Gen blinked because he definitely didn't remember those in the plan. Flash bombs? Senkuu shrugged, just in case. Gen decided he was better off not knowing. He had more to think about anyway. That night, Gen didn't sleep well. Every time he tried, he had the same dream, only the details altered. In every one, Senkuu died. Sometimes it was Tsukasa standing over and a broken neck. Sometimes it was Gen himself and a sickness. Sometimes there was no one, just the knowledge deep down that Senkuu was dead and there was nothing else that Gen could do to stop it. It was funny in a way. Gen always thought the worst part in all this was the guilt. But the dreams hurt the same way. Gen didn't go back to sleep after that. Instead, he thought, really, this whole disease was absolutely ruining his sleeping habits one way or another. He thought about what being the man behind the curtain truly meant. Because the thing about the backup plan was that Gen thought he knew why Senkuu asked him to do it. Maybe if Gen was more trusting or knew himself a little bit less, he could think it was something kinder. That Senkuu chose Gen because of his negotiation skills, and that was it. There was probably some truth to that, too. Senkuu did have a tendency for multitasking. But Gen thought it was more because Senkuu needed someone that could hold it together even at the darkest times. And maybe Senkuu was right to apologize. Maybe that was cruel. Maybe it was selfish. Senkuu always did have a tendency for requesting the most and answered with the same himself. But it was also a necessity. The village couldn't fall apart in the absence of one person, so someone had to do it. Gen knew the village. They weren't weak, but they were innocent. Lives built around community rather than conflict, where the worst threats they had to deal with came from age and the environment. They were kind and hopeful in a way that Gen struggled to understand, and oh, they adored their head scientist. They loved Senkuu. Even a blind man could see it. There was no universe in which they would take losing him well. And when it came to an upcoming war, that was dangerous. Gen understood himself, too, and no matter what happened, he knew how to survive. Above everything, Gen was ruthless. He could be ruthless. Gen wasn't like Senkuu. Gen worked in what-ifs, countermeasures, backup plans. And he cared about this village, too. He wouldn't let it fall apart. For himself, for Senkuu. Gen knew exactly why Senkuu asked him, and it was pragmatics. And it was the right choice. And no, Gen didn't want an apology for that. He hoped it wasn't because Senkuu thought it was because he didn't care. It wasn't that. Gen couldn't fall in love, but he wasn't heartless either. Probably. Maybe. There was blood in Senku's throat that proved him wrong. Whatever, it didn't matter what Gen wanted. Because he didn't want this. He didn't want a Senkuu who had to fear failure, even if it was a Senkuu they needed. He wanted Senkuu to be how he usually behaved, so beautifully caught up in the latest, greatest marvel that the thought of anything less than flying never crossed his mind. Senkuu said Gen was the one in denial, and Gen thought he was probably right. The truth was, Gen had lied earlier, or he'd changed his mind. He didn't want Senkuu to worry for an after, not for anything. Gen would handle that, would be the backup plan they needed. Senkuu could be their first choice, the best set of conditions. And Senkuu could still be human, would always be, and Gen would handle everything else. He wanted Senkuu always able to look for the stars. It seemed so terribly wrong that Senkuu could ever plan to be trapped 6 feet in the ground. Senkuu had also asked if he understood. Yes, Gen understood. But that wasn't the question that needed to be asked. The thing was, Gen wanted to handle the backup plans. He wanted to think of the contingencies. He wanted to be the pragmatic one. He wanted to be the man pulling the strings behind the curtain. And Senkuu, well, it was obvious where Senkuu should be. So Gen made his own plans. After all, science and mentalism was never supposed to be in separate races. They were always better side by side. In the morning sun, Gen threw his arms wide. Oh no, it appears I'm forgetting again. How comes of me? The children all around him giggled. I know, Gen sighed theatrically. I mustn't let Kohaku know how forgetful I'm becoming. I'll be trapped in boring work forever. I'd be ever so grateful if our smart, wonderful workers could help me out again. One hand tapped the drawing on the ground, while the other held up flower bracelets. Can anyone tell me what this one should be? The children, the kids in the circle, scrambled to get a closer look, and again just drew another one, bigger this time. Anyone? It's, Suzu squinted down at the dirt symbol. It's left, isn't it? No, wait! Namari was nearly jumping on his feet, the gold thread laying forgotten by his side. That's the moon! It's the picture thing for the moon, right? Gen tapped his chin. Close, very, very close. It does look like the kanji for both left and moon, doesn't it? He winked conspiratorially. I wonder if they did that to trick us. Well, we can't let them win. Any other guesses? Azura, one of the older and quieter children, curled in slightly, offering a soft stone. That's it! Gen claps happily. Well, that's definitely deserving a special flower bracelet, isn't it? Azura gave a shy smile, offering her hand. Wait, stone? Shovel tilted her head. Like our village name? Exactly right. Gen nodded. That and a few more kanji. Anyone want to learn them? Why don't we start with the one for village? There was a flurry of movement as Gen patiently scribbled the symbols into the dirt as the children craned their necks to see even faster. Gen hid a grin, scribbling a few more for the basic numbers, counting out loud as he went before stepping away so they could all see them. Gen raised an eyebrow, turning to the distinctly not child member of their group. Question? Carbo frowned, eyes kept going to the crowd around the letters before quickly flicking back away. He tapped his fingers restlessly against his broken leg, the reason he'd gotten assigned to the weaving group rather than the gathering missions. I don't get why you're bothering with that. Learning some pictures is only going to distract them. He gestured to the pile of gold coil. Thought we were supposed to be making this then yellow stuff. Ken shrugged. It's just something to pass the time. It shouldn't throw our work too off schedule. Besides, it might be helpful. Gen pretended to consider. Back in mine and Senku's day, people would learn these symbols and write down just about anything they could think of. Hunting, cooking, all the science things Senku's always talking about. They wrote them in big things called books. Every child would learn these symbols, and then they'd be able to know how to learn everything. I shrugged. Wouldn't it be helpful if we had that again? How do you think Senkuu got so smart? Carbo narrowed his eyes like he wasn't still turned unconsciously to the kanji drawings. So what, you're not expecting me to remember all this stuff too, are you? I'm not so good. Gen shook his head. I'm not teaching you. Oh. A flash of disappointment ran by before he could stop it. Good. After all, you're older than them. Gen continued. You should be able to learn much faster. That's why I'll be continuing on you to teach them when I'm busy, okay? Garbo's eyes went wide. What? Do you want me to teach? Don't think you can do it? Gen challenged. Of course I can. Oh, great! Gen beamed. I was really worried. After all, who knows when Senkuu will drag me away? I'll go over the kanji with you every dinner, all right? Then you can teach them in the morning. Does that work? Gen! Suzu shouted out. We learned all these. Give us some more, all right? Oh, well, why don't you try writing them for yourselves now? Carbo can help you out. Gen patted Carbo on the back. Look them over to make sure they match, okay? I'm counting on you. Carbo might have sputtered something else, but Gen was already heading off. After all, there was a solitary figure that had been standing in the shade of a few huts down for a moment too long. Gen came to a stop, hands innocently behind his back. Need me for something already, Senkuu-chan? No, I... Gen stared over at the group of kids, now badgering Garbo to check their work. What are you doing, mentalist? Well, you were right, we don't exactly have time for school. Yet, Gen added carefully. But I don't think there's any harm teaching them the basics. Kids retain new languages better, you know. Yeah, Senkuu said, eyes not moving from Gen. Faster neural formation. More flexibility. Gen shrugged. Well, you'd know the science bits. It's amazing, isn't it? Now all we need is books. Imagine how much they could learn in a few years. Gen, Senkuu started, but didn't finish. Gen understood anyway. The question had never been, did he understand? It was how to say it. So Gen hummed and said the same thing he'd said a month ago in an idle questions game. Only this time he knew what it meant. You know, Senkuu-chan, I've been thinking. Wanting a library isn't selfish. I think you need a new answer. Senkuu blinked, then gave a small smile, almost rueful. Planned self-obsolescence is a little bit of a selfish ask, mentalist. No, because what was needed of Senkuu more than anything was knowledge. The more that was shared, the less the burden. The more human. That was kindness. Not if the request was selfish in the first place. Gen gathered. Senkuu shook his head. Yeah, maybe. Gen grinned. You're feeling pretty pleased with yourself, aren't you? Well, I am now the new frontier in education, Gen said humbly. Just think, in a few decades they'll probably build universities in my name. How's that for a college experience? Unbelievable. Senkuu shook his head. Anything else to say? Gen thought for a second. Then he tried not to think at all. I love you. Senkuu laughed, but it was a gentle one. No, you don't. But nice try. A lot better than the last one. Gen sighed. It was worth a shot. He wasn't in love even still. He didn't know how to be. But it would be nice if it was that easy. Besides, what if I did? Gen asked softly. What if I fell in love on accident and only just found out? That would be romantic, wouldn't it? Senkuu upped a warm breath of air, and if Gen leaned closely enough, he could even feel it. And ruin all these weeks of research? Don't you dare. This is an order. You're not allowed to fall in love with me right now, okay? Gen's mouth turned up in spite of himself, stepping in front of Senkuu so he could see him roll his eyes. Sure, Senkuu-chan, got it. For the perceivable future, you're entirely unlovable. Happy? Ecstatic. You wouldn't know romance, even if it literally infected you, would you? Guess not. Gen saw Senkuu look out at the village, smiling. And with that, Gen finally felt his shoulders relax. This was how it should be. Gen would handle the backup plans, the minutiae, the details. Gen would have a psychology and plan for human behaviors. Lay the chessboard of the world out so every option worked in their favor. He'd watch for the traps and plan for all the terrible what-ifs, so Senkuu didn't have to be scared of failing, could let himself be human. In short, Gen would be the one behind the curtain that pulled the strings. Senkuu could be on the stage, turning into magic. Gen turned on his heel and waved. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have lesson plans to make. It's a very busy, straining job, you know. I don't know how I could possibly have time to do anything else. You're definitely going to use this to get out of work, aren't you? What the... The implications! The nerve! The very nerve! I'm shocked, Senkuu-chan. Offended! Things were easier after that. Gen couldn't exactly put his finger on why. Nothing had really changed. But it was different. Better. Smoother, like everything had found its place. It might have been the mood of the village, sweeping them along. The second telephone was close to done. Half a dozen of Senku's extra projects worked alongside it. And the entire atmosphere of the village drifted between excitement and victory. It was hard not to feel satisfied with that. Senkuu continued to spend his time mostly in the lab. Gen didn't always know exactly what he was working on with the cure, but he knew it was something. And that was enough. Gen would pick up the loose threads. Already had plans in motion if there was any indication in how Carbo was taking to teaching. Determined, near aggressive at rising to the challenge, but surprisingly patient when handling the kids. Gen could work with that. And as for the rest, Gen still found his eyes drifting to Senkuu at the most random times. He still had that pull under his skin, like wanting to reach out and touch and grab. A crush, not quite the same as before, but still decidedly there, almost stronger than before. It was useless, though. He still had faith in Senku's methods, but by now Gen thought he could predict both of his own plans as unlikely. They didn't have months anymore, only weeks, and Gen sincerely doubted he'd have any success convincing Senkuu to fall out of love with them or in lying himself after 3 total failures. It wasn't giving up, not exactly. It was just refocusing his resources. He'd have to trust Senkuu to make the cure, while Gen focused on working in the village to give him the space and time to find it. Crushes didn't fall into the plan, so useless. That was fine. Gen closed his eyes and leaned back against the tree. As long as Senkuu could find a cure in the end, Gen could handle anything. He just wished the crush wasn't still so annoying. Oh? Gen squinted his eyes open. Kaseki looked down at him. What's this? It's old men like me that are supposed to get afternoon naps. Young ones like you should be working. Gen held up his hands. I would, but I'm still so exhausted from working earlier that I think any more work might just kill me. We can't have that. Then we'd be a man down. The village would be ruined. Kaseki continued to stare him down, and Gen felt a bead of sweat run down his neck. Then Kaseki smiled, shaking his head fondly. You need to sleep more, Gen. Gen honestly couldn't believe his luck. Not really. He couldn't believe it. We just finished up the last phone early. Kaseki smiled, sitting down under the tree next to him. Kokuyo suggested we take the afternoon to celebrate, and Senkuu agreed. I think the younger ones are planning some kind of festival. He chuckled lightly, which you'd know already if you weren't hiding. Huh. Gen sat up. Imagine that. He spotted the tools in Kaseki's hands, still idly chipping away at some kind of carving. If we have tonight free, then what's that? Gen asked. Well, Kaseki winked. They said an afternoon off was a suggestion. Gen fought back, and I will. Even in the kingdom of science, there were those that excelled in workaholic tendencies. Senkuu, Chrome, and Kaseki being the world's worst offenders. Maybe you should take a break, though. Kaseki continued. You've been busy lately. Gen frowned. Well, we all are, aren't we? Kaseki merely hummed. That's true. But for you, I've been watching, you know. I like to keep an eye on things. And you're the one that looks the most worn down. He smiled, even when I catch you napping. That's not... Gen grimaced. I'm sure I'm not the most stressed. Really, if anyone's been working the hardest, it's been you and Senkuu. Or Chrome and Kohaku. Kaseki laughed. Maybe. But Chrome and Kohaku have both had harder winters than this one. It's already nice enough to know we'll have food and that we can come back to warm huts at night. What? That's more than we've ever had before. And as for Senkuu... I pause. Actually, you might have a point there. I never understand half of what's in his head unless he's talking about crafting. Senkuu waved a hand. Besides, I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about you. Something's been bothering you, hasn't it? Gen sighed. Honestly, of all the village, Kaseki had always been the one that seemed most like a grandfather. Not Gen's grandfather, of course. Gen's grandfather was an old lawyer who never saw the point in retiring. Before the petrification, his main contact was a letter of money every New Year, even after Gen got famous. Gen was still on the fence on whether it was a nice gesture or if the man simply didn't know enough about Gen's life to notice. Anyway, the point was that Kaseki somehow carried that respected elder vibe as easy as breathing. Impressive, considering Gen knew Kaseki got just as pulled into Senku's schemes as the rest of them. It didn't make it harder to think of a lie. It just made Gen feel less like doing it. I've been thinking through things, Gen answered eventually. It's nothing for you to worry about. Kaseki nodded. What kind of things? Just impossible ones, Gen smiled. So impossible that you'd really supposed I'd stopped thinking about them by now. Kaseki turned his head and looked back at the village. You know, I've lived in this village for more winters than I can count. I was born here, I grew up here, and I learned everything I could. I made the lacquer that kept our shields strong. I made the spears for the grand bout. I made the bridge when the old one broke down, and I thought that was the biggest accomplishment I'd ever have. Kaseki pulled at his beard. I bet it's easy to look at this village like it was when you first got here and imagine that nothing ever changed. But that's not true. It did. Even before you and Senkuu came here. We just had to wait longer to see it. I've seen storms so terrible I thought the world was ending. I've survived winters when I didn't think the village would have anything left come spring. I've seen kids get older and fall in love, and I've seen boys grow up to be chief. Kaseki sighed. The truth about being allowed to grow old is that you start to think that you've seen everything, that anything possible had to have already happened for you to see. He shook his head and smiled. And now look at what this village has become. Isn't it amazing? I never thought I'd see powder that could stop death, or metal that could let you shout across mountains. It's wonderful, and I've never been so excited to be wrong. Kaseki stood up, brushing off his robes. I used to think I'd seen everything that could exist. Now I live every day finding things I didn't know before, so I don't know if I believe in the impossible anymore. Gan swallowed. That's great, but that's not... He looked at the ground. It's not the same. Even if something is possible, that doesn't mean I know how to do it. And if I don't know how, it might as well be impossible, right? Kaseki hummed. It depends. What do you want? And Gen wanted to laugh just as much as he wanted to scream. That's complicated, he answered thickly. Is it? Gen looked up. You're smart, Gen, Kaseki told him. I don't believe you won't find a way if it's something you truly want. Gen didn't answer, and Kaseki didn't look like he was expecting one. He smiled, starting to trudge his way back through the snow. Come back to the fires before it gets too cold. Thank you for listening to an old man's stories. What did Gen want? Well, it wasn't that simple. Was it? Kaseki was right. There was a festival that night, even larger than the one for the first foam. A last party, likely the final chance they'd have for true celebration before the war got truly underway. And it seemed like everyone knew it. Gen felt impatient, unbalanced, too hot under his clothes, even in the cold. He'd like to blame it on the wine, but he hadn't had enough for that excuse to hold up. The excitement and anticipation of the past weeks felt like it was spilling over into something wilder, something that didn't need to be reined in and defined, something that tasted like joy. There was once upon a time that Gen loved parties like this. And what do you know? A few millennia later, and he's still dead. It made it feel like anything and everything was happening, like a night for things impossible. So, what did Gen want to do? That didn't matter, right? What he wanted was complicated and useless. It was a wish in a time where things needed to be concrete. But still, if there was a possibility, what would Gen choose for himself? He already know. Someone had set up the record and hooked it up to play louder. Gen was expecting Senku's involvement somewhere, but it might have been Chrome. The single song washed over the clearing and echoed across the lake. The villagers laughed alongside it, dragging out some of the best of their winter preserves and twirling in the center as others tapped the beat along empty wine jugs. It was sort of almost dancing. Gen would never tell anyone this, but it was kind of terrible in the best possible way, as was probably expected of a village that had apparently never prioritized music. It looked fun, and that was always enough to start a party. And Gen adored this village for so many reasons. Dancing, even though they never learned how, was just one of them. On the other side of the fire, Senkuu sat in between Kohaku and Ruri, letting himself get dragged into the festivities just enough that no one called him on it, and decided to make his lack of involvement a point. Senkuu was not one for the parties, and everyone knew it. Truthfully, Gen was surprised he'd stayed this long. Gen was glad he did, though. Senkuu noticed Gen watching, looked up to catch his gaze on the other side of the circle, and smiled. What did Gen want? It was too far away to see the light of the fire reflect off the red in Senku's eyes, but that was all right. Gen knew what it looked like anyway. Had probably memorized it some lazy evening, and when exactly did he start doing that? Who knew if it was even right? He'd have to get closer to check. Gen wasn't entirely conscious of when his steps started moving in Senku's direction. He didn't really care, honestly. Maybe they always did. Maybe they always would, since the first time he smelled ramen, and it was the best fucking thing he tasted in 3 millennia. Who could say about fate and destiny? And if they couldn't know the truth and the past was only memories, then who really cared? Ruri and Go-Agu had already dragged each other away, spinning and grinning in the middle of the circle. Gen sat next to Senkuu, and once again he felt like he was drowning, only this time he wondered what would happen if he got washed away. You're not dancing, Senkuu-chan? Gen mock shook his head. Really, a song sung for you and you won't even give it one dance? I'm terrible at dancing. Senkuu smirked, and Gen kinda sorta wanted to see it torn apart. Why, mentalist? You gonna make me? I suppose not, Gen agreed. But you'll owe me one, of course. Yeah? Senkuu sighed, leaning back on his hands and watching the village. I don't really like debts. What do you want so I can get out of it? Well, Gen drew out the word. I keep telling you that's a tricky question, Senkuu-chan. Gen remembered right. Senku's eyes always looked most dangerous when reflected in the fire. Is that so? Senkuu asked. What did Gen want? And you know what? If Gen was being very, very honest, there was the first thing he wanted, and it actually was simple. Gen was so fucking sick of listening to the same Lillian Weinberg song. Gen smiled. Do you want to get out of here? Senkuu grinned. There's still a party going on, you know. Gen fought against rolling his eyes. Please, like they weren't already surprised Senkuu was even here. Since still it was Senku's choice. That's a no, then, Gen asked, pushing down the disappointment until his tone was neutral. I didn't say that, Senkuu corrected with a smirk. Thought you were the one that liked these things? Oh, well. Usually I am, Gen said. But right now... He stood and stretched, walking backwards with his eyes still on Senkuu. I have so many better things to do. Want to see? Senkuu laughed and went with him as Gen walked back, away from the party, back to the bridge, and all the way back to the Kingdom of Science, where things were quiet and dark, and most importantly, alone. Gen felt his heart beating too fast in his ribs, but he thought it was only a little bit in fear this time, which meant what was left. Gen hesitated when he got to the general clearing until Senkuu took his arm and dragged him to the lab. Then it was quiet. Just a trace of static in the air. A pull under his skin. Like magnets. Like gravity. Like waiting. This part of your plan? Senkuu asked, his eyes watching him carefully for the response. Not really, Gen said honestly, moving a step closer. Well, not yet. Senkuu snorted. Which one is it? Gen shrugged. I'm adaptable. I don't have to plan things purposely to find a way to use them. Typical mentalist, Senkuu said, but not like he really minded. Gen was close enough that his eyes felt like they were sucking him in. You overthink everything, you know that? Gen huffed, raising a hand to Senku's cheek, waiting. Honestly, Senkuu-chan, I don't think you can accuse someone of overthinking. Senkuu rolled his eyes. No, trust me, I'm not on your level. And that was just... What did Gen want? That was complicated. That was simple. Gen wanted cola and ramen. He wanted to braid flower bracelets for Suika. He wanted Rory to continue seeing amazing things. He wanted Kohaku to never need to worry about things she couldn't change. He wanted Chrome happy and Kaseki to rest. Gen wanted easy days where we never had to work. He wanted the village to be safe. He wanted them to win the war. Gen wanted the petrification never to have happened at all, and Gen never wanted to go back to the life he had before. Gen wanted Senkuu to be alive. Gen wanted all of his million crazy ideas to come true. What Gen wanted was... He breathed out, leaning his head forward. Can I? Senkuu nodded. Yep, Gen kissed him. And he was wrong before. He thought earlier that his fears had been the tide breaking. It wasn't. This was the flood. Gen's hands framed Senku's face softly, even as he pushed him hard towards the table and pressed in. Gen didn't wait to try to find the right movement. It was at first a narrowly avoided rush of clashing teeth before Gen got the angle he needed and weaved a hand into the back of Senku's hair and pulled him closer to hold him there. Senkuu went still, and Gen didn't think he was imagining a short, soft intake of breath. Gen didn't wait to find out. Instead, Gen fought for it, moved in while Senkuu was still catching up, and swiped his tongue fast but undeniably there right across the inside of his bottom lip. He didn't bother with making it nice and sweet like he had earlier. He didn't want it to be. What Gen wanted was messy and borderline painful and good. He wanted something that would leave its mark on both of them. Gen wanted Senkuu to kiss him back. And he did. Senku's hands were on his shoulder, one to his waist, the other to his neck, tilting Gen's head to the side while pressing in. Gen went with the motions because he wanted to know what Senkuu had decided to do. He needed to know. Senkuu was always unexpected. He was proven right a moment later when apparently the last traces of Senku's surprise died an abrupt fiery death when his tongue moved into Gen's mouth, hitting this one angle just to the side of the roof of his mouth that Gen didn't even know was that sensitive, much less like that. Gen sucked in a breath in appreciation, and by the way, Senkuu just radiated a smug air. He knew it, and oh, Gen groaned between breaths. He kissed Senku's chin, his neck, right at the edge of his dumb robe thing. He had a vested interest in finding what it would take to make Senkuu shudder. You know, we could have been doing this weeks ago. This is entirely your fault. Senkuu tried to catch his breath and Gen bit under his jaw and his breath itched. Not my fault. Yours. It's definitely yours. Gen gave up talking for a moment as his lips met Senku's again. He planted his hand on the table behind Senku's waist and pushed the angle back again until Senkuu halfway had to sit on the table to keep balance because, yes, he was definitely shorter and Gen had proof. Gen pulled back to run his teeth to teasingly pull at his lip, and he could feel Senku's fingers tighten on his shoulder. Remember, you're the one who decided it would be bad for the stupid disease. Gen had clear and very frustrating memories of that conversation. Senkuu laughed. That's not why. Gen paused. Yes, it is. No. Senkuu gripped the back of Gen's hair and pulled back enough that Gen could see a raised brow. I stopped because it looked you were trying to solve the fucking Riemann hypotheses whenever you got close. I told you. You overthink shit. Gen pulled back entirely. What? Senkuu rolled his eyes. Just kiss me if you want to, Gen. It's really not that hard to figure out. Gen stared, mouth hanging slightly open, as he tried to recategorize an entire month's worth of conversations. Senkuu sighed, annoyed, and said very, very slowly, Mentalist, do you want to kiss me or not? Well, Gen stopped thinking. Just for a second, he wrapped a hand back around Senku's neck. Yes, I want to kiss you. That's how he did. Senkuu was laughing at him even as he kissed him back. It was a really nice laugh. Gen could hear it, could feel it in the twist of his lips, could taste it in some indescribable way that only made Gen want to pull closer and never let this go. Because kissing Senkuu finally, it felt like the best kind of lies, too nice to actually be possible. Kissing Senkuu it felt warm. Gen was breathing heavily when the necks parted, and he didn't think it was all because of the kiss. I have a crush on you, you know. Yeah? Senku's lip twitched up. That sounds kind of lame. Shut up! Gen groaned and kissed him again. And again. And again. You're the worst! Sure, I could really tell you believe that. Senkuu said to pull Gen down the same time he pushed up. And then he stopped. Gen paused too, watching Senku's face as it went cautious, then blank. Fuck, Senkuu said. Gen frowned. What? Senkuu pushed at his chest, not hard, just enough for Gen to step back before Senkuu was turning his head to the side and coughing hard into his arm. Gen stopped. Everything around him went cold, a reminder of winter still outside. Right, he forgot. Or maybe forgotten was the wrong word. Gen had set it aside for a bit, for a moment. All he wanted was a single moment. The coughing wasn't ending. If anything, it was just getting worse, sounding painful, like it was tearing and ripping on its way out. And for a second, Gen was terrified that it wouldn't stop. Or this time, Senkuu said they still had a couple weeks left. But maybe that was wrong. Maybe Gen had done something stupid and wrong, and maybe this was just it. Maybe the promise was a lie, something of Gen's more than Senku's. Wait, Senkuu ordered between breaths. For what? Gen begged quietly. It's stopping, Senkuu muttered, and slowly, too slowly. He was right. The time got longer between coughs. Gen could hear the deep intakes as Senku's breathing finally settled into something more even. Then the last cough finally died away. Then it was quiet. Like waiting. Only Gen didn't want to see what was waiting on the other side this time. Senkuu just made a face, looking down at the dark flowers in his hands before grabbing a rag from behind the bench and the concentrated alcohol from the shelf and wiping it away. He came back to stand in front of Gen, watching him warily. Don't freak out about this, okay? It's fine. I've had worse. That didn't make him feel better. What Gen wanted was... Hey, Senkuu-chan? Gen started. His heartbeat was pushing fast and hard at his ribs, even as he stood perfectly still. This was different than before, though. Before was a lie. It had always been a lie. This wasn't. This... Well, it felt impossible, but Gen asked anyway. What if I did fall in love with you? Gen said softly. Would that really be so bad an option? Even still struggling to get his breathing right, Senkuu still managed to laugh. I told you, mentalist, give it up. We still have time to solve this thing. We will solve it. That wasn't the discussion Gen wanted to have tonight. The disease was part of it, but it wasn't all. Senkuu? For once, Gen dropped the usual honorific, not wanting to give Senkuu any chance to play this off like Gen wasn't serious. He moved that final bit to grab Senku's chin and lift it up so Senkuu would look at him. This isn't one of my plans, I swear. It's not. Please just answer the question. I need you to tell me. Would it really be that terrible if we saved your life another way? Would it be that bad if I fell in love with you? Senkuu met his eyes. Again felt like he was breaking before Senkuu could even say anything in answer. He didn't need to, not really. Senkuu may say horrible things too casually and too often, but for now, when it was really important, Senkuu always did the courtesy of looking Gen in the eyes before tearing it apart. It won't work, Senkuu apologized. You don't know that, Gen argued, but it felt like a plea. People fall in love for all kinds of reasons. Why can't I? Gen thought that maybe he could do it. Maybe it wasn't impossible. He didn't think he'd ever be able to believe it alone. But maybe if at least Senkuu believed he could, then Gen could convince himself too that he was the type of person able to fall in love. Senkuu was already shaking his head. You don't even like love. You don't want to fall in love with me. I could! Gen needed it to be possible. Please, Senkuu, please. I think I can if it's for you, maybe. I could try. Gen. Senkuu said his name like it was something to hold, neither fragile nor breakable, but something to handle with care in calloused hands. It won't work. Gen's laugh was wet, coming out of his chest and more like a sob. He dropped Senku's chin and used it to scrub at his own eyes, not surprised to find they were still dry, despite what he wanted. Because it was never about what Gen wanted. Not sure. Not even a maybe. Gen's breath hitched. You must really think I'm heartless, Senkuu-chan. For it not even to be an option. To be so incapable of love. Even... His voice broke as he looked away. But then you're probably right. Gen had always been himself, would always be. So maybe Senkuu was exactly right. He usually was, after all. And he'd always been sure about this part, hadn't he? Senkuu had never even once. Even back at the beginning, before he'd told Gen anything, he never thought Gen was capable of feeling the same way, so maybe Gen truly wasn't capable of love. What would the ballads call the true tragedy? The one to fall in love with a heartless man, or the heartless man himself to lose what he held most dear for not being able to hold it dear enough. A stupid question. They were both tragedies. Senkuu would choke on flowers, while Gen choked on everything left behind. And then there was a sigh and arms wrapped around his shoulders, firm rather than cautious, and Gen felt them as a shock like his skin had become static. Senkuu ignored how he went stiff, pulling him closer until Gen's face was pushed into Senku's neck. You're overthinking things, Senkuu huffed, and Gen felt it blow his air. Again. Are you... Gen blinked. Are you hugging me? That's really what you're going to complain about everything else tonight? Well, Gen wouldn't say complaining per se, more confused because going from that everything else to a hug felt... Gen wasn't expecting it. Senkuu was always such a contradiction. To confirm Gen would never be capable of loving him back, even as an alternative. and then pull him into a hug as if Gen was the one who needed comfort. But it felt nice, so Gen let it continue. I honestly don't understand what goes on in your mind sometimes, Senkuu-chan, Gen murmured. Then try asking, Senkuu replied bluntly. And how many times do I have to say to stop putting stupid words in my mouth? I didn't say you were capable of love or whatever. I said I wouldn't believe it, because I won't believe it. Because I know you care, and I know you want to save me. Senkuu pulled back and Gen almost clung tighter instinctively because Senkuu was pulling him away to meet his eyes, which were always dangerous. I won't believe you, Senkuu repeated, because practically the very first night, mentalist, you came to me with some overly sweet hearts and candy love confession that didn't sound like you at all, and I knew right then that you were going to do anything you could think of to try and save me, even if it was forcing yourself to do something you didn't want. He gave a half smile. Even if it meant lying to save me. Senkuu let out a breath. So I'm never going to believe you. Not as long as I've got this stupid flower in my stomach. Not because I think you don't care, because you care too much, and you don't have many limits on what you do for people you care about. He tilted his head back inside. Then he met Gen's eyes. It's one of the reasons I'm in love with you. How could it not be? Gen swallowed, and the motion seemed dry, painful, with how his heart felt like it was in his throat. Senku's never actually said it before. Not directly, not like that. Never. Like that love was a force, something to be cherished rather than just a part of a disease. Never like being in love with Gen was something Senku wanted to do, would choose. He said it like that now. And maybe he always would have if Gen had bothered listening. And maybe Gen was an idiot because he thought he'd understood for all these months, weeks and weeks of working. He thought he understood how Senku loved him. Like an illness tearing him apart, like a disease to be cured, like a mistake on both their parts, or just a misconception. What about that was something to be chosen? Why? I love you, Senku said, words not soft, but deliberate. I love you because you risked your life for months on a village you don't even know and tell me it's for a fucking cola. Because you spent years learning and then wrote it up like cheap tricks so everyone could read it so they'd care to read it. I love you because I trust you. Because you'd watch out for the village even if I can't. Because you care about them too. I love you because I watched you trick Carbo into teaching the kids. Because somehow you figured out it would work. He gave a half laugh. Fuck mentalist, I even love you because you're a stubborn asshole who overthinks too much. Because even then you still make these elaborate schemes for everyone else and lie to my face that you're just being selfish. Senku shook his head, cheeks a faint pink. Anyway, you're also a better liar than me, and you're fucking ruthless, always. If you decided to convince me you'd loved me, you could. I know you could. You're better at this than me. Senku's smile was more painful than beautiful, but it cut all the same. And that's why it won't work. He finished, because Hanahaki needs me to believe you love me, and I'm never going to believe it like this. Not when I think there's even a chance you're doing it to save me. You care too much, Gen. Again, Gen leaned his head against Senku's shoulder, feeling too strung out to bother holding it together. Honestly, he felt like an exposed nerve, too raw and too laid bare to know what shape he should put himself back into. He sighed into Senku's neck. I really can't stand you sometimes. Why does your big stupid brain have to make things so difficult? Senku laughed, hands coming up to wrap around Gen's back and just holding him there. Mine! Yes! Yours! Gen grumbled. Do you know how easier our lives would be if you were just a bit dumber and believed my first confession? We could have had this done months ago. A 5-year-old wouldn't believe that confession. Senku said, voice low in Gen's ear. It sounded like you pulled it out of a bad drama. Gen groaned, curling in further to bury his face in the fleece of Senku's collar. Shut up! You clearly have no appreciation for the finer arts, Senku-chan. Yeah, that was the problem. Gen huffed, enjoying how the sudden exhale of warmth made Senku scream underneath it. Gen huffed, enjoying how the sudden exhale of warmth made Senku squirm under him. A moment passed before Senkuu steadied himself again. Besides, I need that big difficult brain, mentalist, Senkuu said. If not, you'd run me into the dust. Ridiculous! As if anyone could ever overtake Senkuu, at least in anything that mattered. Gen had resigned his life to a dazzling chase of just trying to keep up the moment he'd seen an electric light burn for the first time in 3,000 years. Not that he'd give Senkuu that level of satisfaction, not that easily. So instead, Gen just hummed his disagreement into the skin below him. Oh, please! Gen saw Senku's grin out of the corner of his eye, and it hit him in the chest and stuck there. In the dead of night, with the winter cold still slipping through the cracks, it felt like Senkuu was the only warm thing in the world. Sitting like this, warm even in the dark, Gen knew that he wanted Senkuu. It wasn't quite love, just the same as attraction wasn't love, but that didn't mean it wasn't something. Gen wanted Senkuu just for himself, just to stay beside him. He wanted him in a way that had nothing to do with the village or the war or solving the petrifications. He wanted him as a human, with every certainty that it couldn't be indispensable. But it wasn't what want was, anyway. He just wanted Senkuu here, right now. What Gen wanted was... His hands gripped on Senku's back, knuckles going white. Gen closed his eyes. Don't die. Please don't die. There was a long pause above him, and Gen didn't dare to open his eyes. Then there was something softer. Barely a shift of movement, but Gen felt it anyway, lips pressing ever so slightly, just for a moment, into Gen's hair. Okay, mentalist, Senkuu promised, and Gen's breath shuddered back in. Forcing himself to fall in love with a pointless endeavor, Gen knew himself. He didn't care, but he was also contrary and petty, even to his own desires. And above all, Gen valued being able to figure out for himself what he wanted. Even more so, if a miracle did occur, and Gen did fall in love, Senkuu would never believe him enough to cure anything. He told him that himself. So no, falling in love wouldn't save anything. Which might be exactly why, privately, Gen could finally admit to a truth that had nothing to do with flowers or sickness, existing apart of any outside force, like a bubble of warmth on a winter night. A selfish wish, just for Gen himself. More than anything, what Gen wanted was... I think I want to be in love with you, Senkuu-chan.